morning. Welcome back to the Stone of Stumbling. My name is Jason, one of the pastors at Candlelight, and we have with us again John Loeffler, broadcast journalist. Last time we made some predictions and guesses about the situation in the Middle East, and those have all come true. So before diving into a comparison of Islamic messianic expectations with biblical messianic expectations, we wanted to just stop and get an update on current events surrounding Israel. John, welcome back to the Stone of Stumbling.
Thank you, and I owe you an apology. Last time I was closing the show and I forgot your last name. I mean, I just completely
It's Johnson.
No, don't do that. Don't do that, or I'll say that on today's program. So, I was really surprised when I was doing the research for this show on Islamic end times expectations. I found things I never thought I'd find either. Mm-hmm. And I've tried to make a compendium of it all, but we'll get to that in a second because you wanted to do the geopolitical one first.
Yeah, how did our guesses and predictions pan out just in the last couple of weeks?
Well, actually, surprisingly well. Remember, we did this geopolitical snapshot, we called it, in the last episode, and we said, okay, let's scrub what we're hearing from the media, the day-by-day data points that go flying by, and say, let's look at the overall issue. First of all, this was the first time that Iran has directly attacked Israel. Now, we know they've been attacking Israel by means of their proxies all over the place, but they finally responded.
How long has it been since there's been a direct attack? Not in my lifetime.
No, there hasn't been, not from Iran attacking Israel. Mm-hmm. Now, they've been threatening to do that. I mean, that's important. And they're moving very steadily towards their nuclear program. And whereas the Trump administration tried to block that, the Obama and Biden administrations have been pretty well allowing it to go on. So that was the first most important thing. The second thing, and we talked about this last week, and that's why this is really important, is Jordan and Saudi Arabia supported Israel in shooting down the drones and missiles. Now, there's significance to this. First of all, about well over 90% of the attacking implements, whether it was a missile or a drone, never ever made it even inside the borders, the airspace of Israel. What this means is the Abraham Accords are alive and well.
Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, remember last week we talked about the fact that after the attack happened on Israel, everybody was shocked. We knew the media was going to try to move that narrative back to sympathy for Palestinians and make the Israelis the heavy, because that's their narrative. Okay, and Saudi Arabia was forced to backpedal on the whole issue of as to whether or not they were going to support the Abraham Accords, because there was tremendous internal pressure to reject Israel, reject the Abraham Accords. You have to remember, and maybe we should start with Saudi Arabia, because I was originally we were going to look at Jordan, but what you have to recognize is that Saudi Arabia is running out of oil. Okay, their oil fields are all in decline, no new fields, blah, blah, blah. Prince Mohammed bin Sultan knows that they've got to do something to preserve Saudi Arabia afloat. They also know they have a common enemy, and the common enemy is Iran. Iran is Shiite, Saudi Arabia, although they do have some Wahhabi elements in there, Saudi Arabia is Sunni. And they understand that their strongest ally in the Middle East is Israel. The Arab countries, especially the Sunni countries, are getting absolutely sick and tired of the Palestinian issue. They have decoupled from it. And they said, we're going to settle this. You guys, if you wanted a state, you could have had it by now. But you keep raising it up, blah, blah, blah. And Saudi Arabia didn't. Then they were forced to recouple it, at least for public consumption. And it's really always important to understand governments do things, and media, FPC. For public consumption, which has nothing to do with what's really going on. It's really to placate a few people here and there. And the world was actually pronouncing, after the attack, was pronouncing the death of the Abraham Accords as a result of Israel's war with Gaza at the time. And you could see this chasm between the global media's narratives on what was happening there and the reality on the ground in the Middle East. It just becomes glaringly obvious. And you have to remember that this is the same media who told us that an Arab Spring was breaking out, remember 15 years ago or so, after we had this collapse of the normal situation in the Middle East. And that was triggered by, I really believe it, I benchmark it at President Barack Obama's speech at Al-Azhar University, where he specifically went out of his way to talk to the Muslim Brotherhood, the granddaddy of all terrorist organizations, founded back in the 1920s by Hassan al-Banna. And he basically signaled two things. We weren't going to treat Israel the way we had before, as a good friend. And number two, we weren't going to be the policemen of the Middle East the way that we had been. Very shortly after that, kaboom! There were revolts and riots all over the place, and they had to be brutally put down by the various governments. Libya is still in a civil war today. It hasn't escaped after they managed to execute Muammar Gaddafi. And I lived in Libya for a year, and it was just before Gaddafi came in. So I remember what it was like, and I saw what happened after his existence, and we went on and on. What people don't realize, what doesn't match the narrative in the Middle East, or the media's narrative about the Middle East, is allegiances in the Middle East are very family and tribally oriented. This is very important to understand. The boundary lines of today's modern countries were put there after the San Remo Agreement, after World War I, by the Allied powers, notably Great Britain and France. They're artificial boundaries which were imposed on top of the Middle East. The Arab world going all the way from let's see, you're going to look left to right. So we'll go all the way from the Atlantic all the way through Saudi Arabia and into Iraq and Iran. Well,
And
Iran is not
so
Arab.
these tribal connections sort of run crosswise sometimes with the geographic boundaries.
Absolutely.
We're not aware of what's happening kind of tectonically and underground, but they're there.
That's correct. And the governments are largely secularist governments. And they have to hold this lid on this pressure valve. They're a pressure, like in a pressure cooker. And they hold this lid on their Muslim populations of whatever stripe they happen to be, because Islam is a theocratic type of religion and governmental system. It's all in one. You can't break them apart.
Well, and I have a thought. I can't remember if you wanted to talk about Jordan, but Jordan is one of the sort of conundrums in here, where Jordan seems to be, which side are they on, and how do they relate to this? This conundrum that Saudi Arabia faces.
Whenever you ask a question like that, I always want to go, well, it is very interesting that you have asked this question, since we have been asking this question for about 70 years.
Yes, it's not a new question for sure.
Between the two. No, and what Jordan has a problem. About 60 to 60% of its population is Palestinian. Okay, they're actually Palestinians live there. Remember in the 1970s, early 1970s, Yasser Arafat and the PLO, before Yasser Arafat became a peace partner, it's always interesting that what we do is we take terrorists and then we baptize them as peace partners, and we'll put that in cadiddles there, since that's what it is. And Jordan is in danger of an overthrow right now, and Iran is trying to force it. They want Hamas to overthrow the government of Jordan, of King Abdullah II, whose grandfather, King Abdullah I, was assassinated on the steps of Al-Aqsa Mosque when he wanted to come to peace terms with the Israelis. Early on, he recognized publicly that the Jews had a claim upon the land it was called Palestine at the time, that they were not co-religionists, but that they had common origins and roots, and that they were half-brothers, so to speak. And he wanted to do that. So for his effort, he got assassinated, very much like Anwar Sadat did in Egypt after he did that. That was, again, by more Muslim Brotherhood and extremist elements. So Jordan is in a real, pickle. And Jordan frequently turns to Israel for help. They need Israel's help for security purposes. They need the tourism. They need economic interaction. And so it's what you call an uneasy, or at least an official peace treaty which works. Because a lot of tourists, go to see things in Israel like Masada, and then they'll zoom over to see Petra and come back. And Jordan needs that. They need these dollars and this stuff type of coming in.
Well, and given that you've noted the high percentage of Palestinian population in Jordan, it's important to remember Hamas's original goal in all of this. I just had a conversation with one of our staff today whose best friend wants to go to Israel today to support Hamas. the narrative that's out there, it sounds so, I know in our circles that sounds ridiculous, it sounds strange, but what we've got is the strength of this narrative by which the Palestinians are victims and Hamas is their protectors against an apartheid state. That whole narrative is still so strong, despite the fact that it's collapsing before our eyes.
Well, that narrative is maintained in academia. I mean, that's why it's there. And remember that the media and academia see everything through hocus pocus filters. That's postmodern thought, and it's also cultural Marxism that came out of the
And they're not
Franco
asking, they're not keeping the question in front of us, what does Hamas really want?
Right. I mean, Hamas told you what they want when they were founded, okay?
Yes, that's right.
You know, they told you that they are dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Hezbollah is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. It's amazing. It was sort of like Hitler's Mein Kampf. You know, the Führer told you ahead of time what he was going to do. You know, all you had to do was read the book, and it's the same deal. But we have this
If they say they want to kill you, believe them.
If they believe it, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's the first thing you do when you're under attack, is you have to say to yourself, self, yes, you're under attack, stupid. Oh, does that mean I have to do something? You know.
Probably so.
Probably so.
Yes.
And so we see Saudi, and that's probably the first issue, is Saudi and Jordan. Okay, the Abraham Accords are alive and well. And we said that last week on the show. This isn't going anywhere. This is going to slide under the table for a while till the heat comes off, and then Saudi will be back on the table again. They need Israel for economic ties. They need Israel for security ties. And Saudi's trying to reinvent itself as a tourist destination, very much like Dubai and other, you know, great spots to come into the Mediterranean, not the Mediterranean, but the Indian Ocean when you want to take a break. You know, Europeans love this. They like to fly south and do that. But remember, as you said, you brought up the subject of Hamas. And Hamas's purpose in launching this war was not to gain territory or any type of military victory over Israel.
It's not even what we would call geopolitical in that sense.
That's right. The only purpose they had was to create a major public relations event, knowing exactly how Israel would react, and the useful idiots in the global media would support Hamas. They knew that ahead of time, and they were planning on just creating this mess. They needed victims. This is the tragedy of Hamas. You know, Israel's getting the blame for this, but it's Hamas who puts its rocket launching centers in schools and hospitals. It's Hamas that was using a hospital for a command control center and turned the maternity ward into a weapons cache, okay? Instead of them getting the blame for violations of international criminal law, they turned to Israel based on manufactured statistics coming from Hamas. We still don't have the most accurate tally of who's been killed, and Hamas made no difference between civilians or enemy combatants. And as best we can tell, the ratio, and this is a cruel statistic, it's a cruel one, of war, because I hate war. It just tears your heart to see people get killed. The normal ratio, according to the UN, of civilians to enemy combatants killed is 9 to 1. 9 civilians for every soldier. As best we can tell at this war, it's been 1.5 to 2 that in this, because Israel is so careful. Israel is so careful when they launch these attacks, these surgical strikes. And they even call them ahead of it. I always think about World War II, and the
rules of engagement are just night and day.
Just night and day, you know. And so that's why. And that's why they hide behind civilians and put headquarters in hospitals and launch things from schools, because they want that reaction. They want that global sympathy, because they don't have the strength to defeat Israel, but they can turn the world opinion against it. And it worked. It worked to a large degree. You have to admit that.
John, is this business as usual, or is there enough different going on this time that there is an adjustment in strategy by IDF?
They are reevaluating how they do things. The one thing they had to learn how to do is how to fight in tunnels, because remember, Hamas built you have to think about this, over 400 miles of sophisticated tunnels. This is where this humanitarian aid that went to Gaza all went into, instead of developing the economy of Gaza, where the Israelis had not been for 18 or better years.
And we built them their infrastructure for this guerrilla war.
And we built this infrastructure. The Israelis have become very good at tunnel warfare, at going through it and displacing the people, because Hamas had hoped to hole up there until world opinion switched against Israel and then force a ceasefire. That was the whole strategy. Well, of course, that completely flooped. But maybe in a future show we could talk about what the IDF is planning now and how this whole thing is shifted. We are moving through paradigm shift after paradigm shift, and it's moving very fast.
John, I know you wanted to get to the Islamic expectations of eschatology, but can I ask one more brief question on this topic?
Just get one more.
Just one more. This is brief. I can't answer for your answer being brief. So we've had a team over in Israel, and on our end, we were hearing nothing but the fear of Iran weighing in here. And this is next level, as we noted earlier. This hasn't happened in decades. However, what our team was experiencing on the ground was just kind of watching the Iron Dome go to work. It just, in many ways, it was like another day in Israel.
Yeah, it was a potentially dangerous fireworks show.
That's right, and it seemed as if Iran needed to puff up. It seems as if they needed to rattle their sabers for the sake of their part in this phase of the PR war. That's what it seemed like by the time all of this is said and done.
A great essay was written by a U.S. Army colonel back in 2001. I keep it. It's one of those essays that I like to read, Why Arabs Lose Wars. Now, Iranians are not Arab, although the mullahs ruling Iran come from an Arab background. They're not Persian.
The people are Persian.
But the people are Persians. And not a lot of them like the government that they have right now. Okay. But no, you're right about that. And you have to remember,
you were about to mention the essay.
Well, the essay, because he talks about the fact that the whole societal situation in the Middle East is based on tribal and family-related issues and power structures. Okay.
And very much honor, shame, and face-saving.
Right. And you see the Spaniards. Remember the Moors occupied the Spanish Peninsula, the Hispanic Peninsula, for since 600 until 1492, when Isabella and Ferdinand threw them out. And there's even an expression in Spain today, hay moros en la costa. There are Moors on the coast, which means, when you're asking, or they says, no hay moros en la costa. The coast is clear.
That's how they say the coast is clear to this day. There are Moors on the coastland.
Right, exactly. Wow. And so they pushed them out. But you see this today, and that's what he said. Why? He said Arabs are very good at short-term skirmishes. T.E. Lawrence knew this, over 100 years ago. Short-term skirmishes, but long-term strategy is different. Now, Hamas has learned that when you realize how they did this attack. This was a well-trained army in a very good command structure with plenty of training, etc. So this is another sea change that's happening, And in this essay, and I wish I remember the colonel's name, he talks about they had printed up all these tank manuals for Egyptian troops that they were training to operate their tanks. And they'd gone to great effort to translate them into Arabic. And he said they went around and passed them all out to the tank crews, and the commanders went around and collected them all, because their whole position depends on them knowing more than the people in the tanks know. And even within the tanks, he said, they would not cross-train. So the driver wasn't cross-trained to fire whatever the weapons were attached to there. And so if somebody got killed, the other guys in the tank didn't know what to do.
Literal total compartmentalization.
Total compartmentalization. Yes. So it was a wonderful essay because he understood the cultural significance of this. And that's, we need to get eschatology, because this part of it's really exciting.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Let me just tee this up again, if that's okay, John. Islamic descriptions of end times, and they do have very specific descriptions of end times in the hadith, in the traditions.
Right.
They have very specific scenarios and outlines, and I did not know this. I didn't know it as deeply as your notes now have kind of highlighted for me. I knew there was some of this. I knew that they have a 12th Imam. I knew that there's a Mahdi. I knew some general things, but I didn't know how much detail it appears in which they align with specific Christian prophetic expectations. And yet it's weird, it's inverted, it's not exact, and it's night and day, but the similarities by which they are opposite to each other are eerie.
It really is.
It's really strange, but worth looking into. Isn't that correct, John?
That actually surprised me when I started to do the research for this show, and I began listening to lectures by
I mean, they have a Christ, they have an Antichrist, they have a version of the tribulation, they have a version of the rapture.
Right.
They've got a kind of a millennial reign.
Right.
It's all there. And even the narrative seems to track.
So why don't they just become Christians? I don't
That's
get
what my question is, of course. It seems
the
obvious.
question. Yeah, they actually seem, bear in mind that Muhammad came along afterwards by about 500 years following Christ and the origins of the Christian church. By the time Muhammad came along, the entire Mediterranean basin had been Christianized. You have to realize that. And then it was Islam.
Egypt, Ethiopia.
Yep. Libya,
yes.
Hippo,
North Africa
Augustine?
was famously, St. Augustine was North Africa. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so remember, you talked about the traditions. Now here's what you have to understand. I've been listening to Islamic imams, their lectures on the end times. It's just fascinating for me to sit there and listen to some of this stuff because it was more intense than I really thought it was going to be. Most of the end time scenarios are not mentioned in the Quran, but they are mentioned in the Hadith. Now, I'll get to the Hadith in a second. The Quran does speak of the day of judgment, when everything will be destroyed, followed by judgment, followed by heaven or hell. The book of deeds will be read out loud for everybody. Those who passed away will be standing in a separate group, awaiting the appearance of a scroll that details their good and bad deeds. If people are good, they go to Jannah, that's heaven. If they're bad, they go to Jahannam, which is hell. People who are victims will be repaid. People who have been living responsibly will be rewarded. Aha. Now, okay. So what?
Some of this sounds vaguely familiar.
Sounds familiar. But now the question is, you mentioned the Hadith. Where does the rest of this come from? Okay. The Hadith is like a series of commentaries. Like in the Jewish faith, you start with the Torah. You have the Torah, the Tanakh, the prophets, and the first 5 books of Moses. But then you have 2,000 years of a Talmud.
Yeah, oral tradition attached to translations.
That's correct. And commentaries of the famous rabbis, etc. The Hadith is a lot like that as well. There's only one Quran, no matter which branch of Islam you are from. It's identical in its translation, and they actually prefer to use the Arabic. And so you will find people who are not even Arabic speaking memorizing verses of the Quran.
Technically,
in
it's
Arabic.
not the Quran any longer if it's translated.
Yeah, technically, right.
Understand.
And they treat the book very respectfully. You can't put it on the ground. As a matter of fact, in some places, people want to become Muslims. They will not let them read the Quran. A Muslim has to read the Quran to them. Okay. But the Hadith was supposedly the sayings of Muhammad, post-Quranic, and the companions of Muhammad, the things they heard Muhammad say, or some of their ideas. However, that only lasted for a short time. And then, I'm sure most of our viewers know, where there was a split between the Sunnis and the Shias. And the
This
content...
was over succession,
Over
sort
succession,
of,
right.
Yeah, who was Muhammad's successor?
Was it going to be a family descendant, like from the first successor was his son-in-law and cousin, Ali, or would it be an elected caliph, elected caliph, as we would say in the English version? What happened there is at the same time that split, the Hadith began to split too, and you actually find Muslims giving various ranks of acceptability, sort of acceptable, or maybe not too great, because both the Sunnis and the Shias have different versions of the Hadith. And that's why it was a real challenge to try to say, I'm trying to think here.
What are the expectations?
What are the
that's
expectations?
right, yeah.
That was it. Okay, so
Well,
what I did before you start, just so you know, what I did was I took a compendium. I said, well, let's blend this all together and give people a snapshot, not a timeline, a snapshot. Okay, that's the difference.
Well, and in our interest, the broad outlines are going to be what are striking. And of course, any Muslim in the room might argue about which one of these is true for that person.
Exactly.
But we're very interested in the fact that when you mash it all together, it is so similar. There are so many elements that are precisely biblical, except just torqued. And by the way, and I kind of want to hear you outline this. You've done the research, but as you're doing this, think with me about this and help me answer this. John, isn't it interesting to find out that Islamic expectations of the Messiah, the end times, a tribulation, a millennial kingdom, even a rapture, have more elements of premillennial dispensationalism, such as we teach, like they're almost more weirdly similar to us than some non-prophetic thinkers in our own Christian camp.
Absolutely. That's what startled me.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at people who just allegorize
That's right.
everything away, as I mentioned during one of our episodes, if you are not into a dispensational mode, I remember studying to be a Catholic priest for a long time, and I would read the Old Testament and go, well, this is sort of neat, but there it is. What do you do with it?
It's a parable.
It's a parable because they were into replacement theology.
Right.
You know? But they do mention an Antichrist, all right? That's Dajjal. That's who he is. He's called the Masih al-Dajjal. According to the stories, he's going to be a human being. He's blinded in his right eye, and he has the word kafir. It's hard to translate or pronounce
Infidel,
that name.
right?
Infidel,
Infidel
right.
or unbeliever.
But I asked Pastor Asif here, who's from Pakistan, I said, how is that used? Because they refer to you Christians in Pakistan as a kafir. I said, is it a derogatory term? And he said, yes, it's one of, you know, you're one of them. Okay. But since he'll have the word kafir written on his forehead, which sort of reminds you about the mark of the beast on the hand of the forehead, that would enable Muslims to recognize him immediately. Overall, Antichrist will turn Muslims away from the true faith and get them to worship him. Okay? And so Antichrist wreaks havoc on the earth for a while, and then you never guess who shows up in the midst of all this. Put your seatbelt on. Isa shows up.
Jesus.
Jesus, right. That's the Arabic word for
Literally Jesus of Nazareth.
Right. And Isa will descend from heaven on the wings of two angels onto a mosque in Damascus. I hope the roof is strong enough when he lands.
So he is coming as an opponent of their Antichrist.
That's correct.
And a victor over their Antichrist, but it's Jesus, but it's not Jesus as the Bible teaches.
Right, but remember, they do believe that Jesus was a prophet. I mean, that's important. So, and then Jesus will go out and he'll start searching for the Antichrist, and he will find them at a place called Bab al-Lud, and that's basically near modern-day Tel Aviv today. And it is said in the stories from the Hadith that the Antichrist would begin to melt just upon seeing Jesus. Now, this one I sort of had to laugh about because all I could think of is the
Raiders
Wicked Witch of the...
Ark.
No, I wasn't. Well, that's true. I didn't think about that. I was thinking about the Wicked Witch of the West. And there was no, I'm melting.
Yes.
And I saw that. And Jesus thrusts the spread in. And I don't mean to disrespect. By the way, we laugh about some Christian things too. I always tell people, whenever you deal with other people's faith and religions, always respect them.
That's right.
Yeah, we may not agree with it, but be respectful, right?
Yep.
But Jesus will thrust a spear into the body of Antichrist, finishing him off. Jesus proclaims Islam to be the true religion, and Christians will convert. All other religions would be eliminated at that time. And then Jesus ushers in a period of peace for, brace yourself again, 7 years, and leads an Islamic theocracy. All harmful beasts will be domesticated. There will be abundance of grain.
Our 7 years is the Great Tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble. Their 7 years is the time of
peace,
safety, and security.
Right, exactly. And so all world wars would cease and there would be peace, and that Isa, Jesus, would periodically go to Mecca and perform certain rituals. And
they've even got a Gog and Magog.
Well, I was going to get to that one next. You know, I was expecting you to say, oh, great, so there's a period of peace and harmony, right? And no, they have Ajud and Majud will be released. And this is the exact equivalent of Gog and Magog, and they sometimes refer to it as that. This is mentioned in Surahs 18 and 21 of the Quran.
And those are chapters, basically.
And those are chapters.
Yep.
And these are two people who are currently being trapped behind a barrier to be released before the end of the world. Now think of the two witnesses.
Yes.
And you see this just tracks on down with the whole thing. Jesus will pray to Allah. Allah will destroy the armies of Ajud and Majud, of Gog and Magog. And that period is supposed to last overall about 40 years. 21 years into this, Jesus will marry. He will have children. 19 years later, he'll die and be buried next to the Prophet Muhammad in the city of Medina to await the day of resurrection with all others who have passed away. And before the end of the world, there's coming a good beast who comes out of the earth and tells everyone to recognize Allah as the only God. I mean, you have...
Which is what we would actually expect of the beast.
Right. I mean,
right?
this
to
is
point
what's haunting.
to the false prophet. Yes.
I'm laughing not at the Islamic belief, but at the parallels, and you can see where they're contrapuntal.
That's right.
They're working opposite of each other here.
It's different than just, say, comparing mainstream doctrine of Christianity to something like the Latter-day Saints or to the Watchtower Society. It's even more similar and inverted than that. John, do you think that there's a sort of an underhanded apologetic here, like a hostile defense for Christianity and for our brand of it, in the sense that if Satan were going to create a counterfeit to Christianity, he's trying to counterfeit our version of it. These Islamic expectations look like a mirror of dispensationalism.
Right.
They're not, Satan's not out there trying to counterfeit a Christianity that has zero eschatological expectations.
The best lie is one that's 99% true.
Yes, that's what this looks like to me.
And they come in, they'll be expecting X when they're getting Y. And that's why I said when I did the research on this and listened to some of these lectures, I went, wow, this is it isn't just that.
Haunting is the right word.
It's haunting. They won't know what to do with this because these things are working contrapuntally. We talked about the rapture, right? Yes, there is an Islamic version of the rapture. There will be a breeze coming through the land to take up the souls of believers so they will not experience all the punishments that happen in the end times period of time before the last day. Okay.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and before the last day, there will be a fire that breaks out near modern-day Yemen, which spreads worldwide, forces everyone to go to a place of assembly in Syria, which includes modern Palestine and everything. And the one thing we haven't talked about is the Imam Mahdi.
It feels like we might need another episode for this. I feel like we could go on and we could unpack a lot of this.
Well, it depends. We can briefly mention the Imam, and then we can talk about it and see if we want to do it in a future episode. Because there are other things we were going to talk about, the IDF and their strategy and some of the geopolitics. But, you know, the Shiite community in Iran is especially concerned about the return of the 12th Imam. The Mahdi is a title meaning the one who is rightly guided. That's what it means. He will guide to something hidden, will bring out the Torah and the Gospel from a town called Antioch. He will lift the Ark of the Covenant out of the Sea of Galilee, out of the Sea of Tiberias. And I keep thinking maybe the Israelis should just run up there right now and deep dive and go get it, you know, or something like that. There are serious differences, in all seriousness, between Sunni and Shiite Muslim experiences about the nature, or expectations about the Mahdi. The Quran has no information about that, but there are over 20 hadith, as they're called, about the Mahdi, meaning passages from the various Hadidic traditions right there. And so that's why Iran is doing what they do. They believe they play a role because the Mahdi will set up his caliphate in Jerusalem. From there, he will war against the Jews. They will either convert or be destroyed. From there, he will lead the war into Europe to the Vatican. And
John, this is why we're talking about the stone of stumbling. This is why we're talking about Jerusalem in the Middle East, because the meaning of it, you cannot penetrate the meaning of all these geopolitics unless you understand these messianic expectations.
That's right. And they all revolve around what? Jerusalem, right? And so you have, and that's why we started calling this series A Stone of Stumbling, because you have two groups of people fundamentally expecting different things over the issue of Jerusalem, which is the rock of offense, the stone of stumbling that everybody's going to confront at the end times,
including us today.
Including us today. Yeah, I mean, we're all involved in this, you know. But like I said, it was, as I began to go into it, I thought, okay, well, they've got some kind of a thing, and every time I ran across more and more, I went, oh, this sounds weird, you know, like it's, again, contrapuntal to what we're now that we've said this, there'll be 50 million divers out in the Sea of Galilee looking for the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah,
you know?
And we will get questions about this.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, remember, the Bible says the Ark of the Covenant won't be remembered again. In other words, it disappears from history and it will not be remembered again. You know, so I know there's been a lot of speculation about the Ark being in Ethiopia, and Maybe so, maybe not.
Or some
but-
warehouse.
Or somewhere else, or,
Yeah.
we can go through that. But it has been interesting. So, what do you think?
Let's do this again.
Okay, sounds good. Now, we will try to do that again because we can get very long-winded here. So please, do remember to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, okay? Pray for the persecuted church when you think about them, especially in Nigeria. They had a bunch of girls again kidnapped by radical Muslims that are there. 4,000 Nigerians were killed between 2022 and 2023. And you notice the world didn't even flinch for all of the river to the sea rhetoric, etc. Nobody seems to care about that. And also, there are about estimated 100,000 Iranians that have converted to Christianity. And they're meeting in home churches because they see what a fundamentalist Islamic theocracy looks like, and they want no part of it, So remember to pray for the persecuted church. Tell your friends about the podcast, and this week I'm going to remember it on behalf of the Right Reverend Pastor Dr. Jason Murray.
Correct.
Which I forgot. And myself, John Loeffler. God bless. Pray for us when you think about us.